When my brother-in-law tossed a cheap pencil onto my son Toby's graduation plate, mocking his future, I checked my phone. "I'm Darlene, 48, an escrow officer." His smile vanished when he saw my screen. He thought we were charity. He didn't know I'd already signed his ruin. The afternoon heat in Dublin, Ohio, was the kind that clung to your skin like a damp sheet. My sister Annette's backyard looked like a page torn from a luxury home magazine, all perfectly manicured creeping bentgrass, limestone pavers that didn't absorb the heat, and a sparkling saltwater pool that Toby had never been allowed to swim in without asking permission first. I sat at the edge of the patio, my fingers tracing the worn plastic handle of the Tupperware container I'd brought from home. Inside were 3 dozen lemon squares, baked late last night in my own cramped kitchen after a 10-hour shift at the title company. My hands, dry and rough from decades of sorting through heavy bond paper and land deeds, felt out of place next to the linen napkins Annette had rented for the occasion. I watched the caterers in their crisp black aprons carry trays of smoked salmon crostini past my sister's country club friends. Nobody touched my lemon squares. They sat on the end of the buffet table, a small, yellow island of middle-class efforts in a sea of hired luxury. I looked at Toby, my sweet, quiet boy. He was 18 today, standing there in his navy blue graduation gown, looking slightly too large for his clothes, like a puppy that hadn't quite grown into its paws. He had graduated in the top 10% of his class, but instead of heading to an expensive private university that would require a lifetime of debt, he had chosen a precision machining program at the local vocational school. He had a gift for making things with his hands, a quiet focus that reminded me so much of my late father, Arthur. "Look at him," my brother-in-law, Richard, boomed, his voice carrying icily over the soft jazz playing through the outdoor speakers. Richard was a commercial real estate developer, a man who wore pastel polo shirts with little embroidered logos and drove a leased silver Mercedes that he parked diagonally in his own driveway. He had a way of standing that suggested he owned the air he was breathing, the graduate, the future of. What was it again, Toby? Operating heavy machinery? Making sure the gears turn for the guys who actually own the buildings. A few of Richard's golf buddies chuckled, sipping their craft beers. Toby's shoulders tense under the cheap polyester of his gown, but he kept his eyes on his plate. He didn't say a word. He had his grandfather's quiet dignity, the kind that doesn't feel the need to bark back at every passing dog. But I felt it. If you've ever sat at a kitchen table with a calculator, trying to figure out how to stretch a single paycheck to cover a mortgage, groceries, and a boy's dental work, you know the exact temperature of the cold sweat that runs down your spine when someone who has never struggled tries to make you feel small. I had spent 20 years as an escrow officer at Buckeye State Title, verifying signatures, reading the fine print, and watching people like Richard try to slide things past the rules. I knew exactly who he was. "Now, Richard," Annette said, her voice thin and high like a glass bead rolling across a tile floor. She adjusted her designer sunglasses, her manicured hand fluttering near her throat. "Toby worked very hard. It's a very practical career choice." "Practical?" Richard sneered, stepping closer to our table. He reached into his breast pocket and pulled something out. He didn't offer a card, or a check, or even a handshake. Instead, with a theatrical flick of his wrist, he tossed a cheap, yellow Dixon Ticonderoga pencil onto Toby's plate. It landed with a dull clatter against the porcelain, rolling through a smear of mustard. The pink eraser on the end was dried out and cracked. "Here's a pencil. That's all your son will ever need, Darlene," Richard mocked, looking directly at me with a grin that didn't reach his eyes. "To sign those community college enrollment forms, or maybe his name on the unemployment line when the machines take his job. You gotta start at the bottom, right?" The laughter that followed was light, polite, and devastating. Toby looked down at the pencil, his face flushing a deep, painful red. My Aunt Clara, who was sitting next to me, gripped my forearm. Her knuckles were white, her old joints swollen with arthritis. "Darlene," she whispered, her eyes shining with unshed tears of anger. "Don't let him do this to your boy." I didn't flinch, I didn't raise my voice. In my line of work, you learn very quickly that the loudest person in the room is usually the one with the most to hide. The quietest person, however, is the one holding the pen. I reached into my purse, my hand brushing against a worn blue ink notary stamp, a tool I had carried for 25 years, a symbol of my honesty and my livelihood. But I wasn't looking for my stamp. I was looking for my phone. It was exactly 4:15 p.m. I unlocked the screen. There, sitting in my inbox, was a notification from the Ohio Department of Commerce and a CCD email from the Franklin County Auditor's Office. The timestamp on the official digital filing was 4:12 p.m. Perfect timing, I murmured, my voice steady, cutting through the tail end of the laughter. Richard's smile didn't just fade. It seemed to freeze on his face, like grease cooling on a pan. He looked at me, his eyes narrowing. "What did you say?" My sister Annette must have felt the sudden shift in the air. She stepped forward, her hand reaching out to touch Richard's sleeve, but her eyes were fixed on me. She knew. She didn't know the details yet, but she knew that for the past 3 weeks, I had been unusually quiet. She knew that I had stopped answering her condescending texts about Toby's modest future. "Darlene," Annette whispered, her voice dropping an octave, losing its high society sheen. "Don't do this. Not here. Not in front of everyone." "Don't do what, Annette?" I asked, looking her dead in the eye. I stood up slowly, smoothing down the front of my $20 department store dress. I felt the weight of every late-night shift, every lunch I'd skipped to save $5, and every time I'd had to smile and thank Richard for his generous hand-me-downs that were actually just trash he didn't want to haul to the dump. The truth was, the injustice hadn't started today with a cheap pencil. It had started 6 months ago, when my father, Arthur, passed away. Dad had owned a 3-acre commercial parcel on the northern edge of the city, a piece of land he'd bought in the 70s for next to nothing. In his final days, as he lay in his hospital bed with his breath rattling in his chest, he had held my hand and told me that the land was meant for Toby. "To give him a head start, Darlene," Dad had whispered, his voice dry as autumn leaves. "You've worked too hard, and I want that boy to have a foundation. I've put it in a custodial trust for him." But when the estate was settled, Richard had presented a deed. A quitclaim deed, supposedly signed by my father just 3 days before his death, transferring the entire 3-acre parcel to Richard's development company, Dublin Heights LLC, for the sum of $10 and other valuable considerations. I had been too grief-stricken to look closely at the time. I had trusted my sister when she cried on my shoulder and told me that Dad must have changed his mind, that Richard had promised to manage the land to help pay for Dad's medical bills. But those bills had already been covered by Medicare. It wasn't until 3 weeks ago, when a routine title search came across my desk at Buckeye State Title for a massive commercial loan Richard was securing, that I saw the deed myself. The signature on the quitclaim deed was a clumsy forgery of my father's shaking hand. But the real betrayal, the knife that went straight into my back and stayed there, was the notary stamp. The deed had been notarized using my own professional notary commission number, with a forged signature of my name. Richard had gone into my desk at my house during Dad's wake, taken my old notary login stamp, and used my identity to steal my son's future. He had used my 25 years of clean, honest professional standing to commit a 3rd-degree felony, knowing that as a single mother I would be too afraid of the legal fees and the family scandal to ever fight back. He thought my silence was something he could buy with a few dinners and some polite condescension. I looked down at the yellow pencil resting in the mustard on Toby's plate. "You're right, Richard," I said, my voice echoing slightly off the limestone of the patio. The backyard had gone completely silent now. The caterers had stopped moving. The country club guests were holding their breath, their glasses suspended mid-air. A pencil is a very useful tool. It's got an eraser on the end, useful for rubbing out mistakes. But some mistakes are written in ink, and some are stamped in the public record, Richard's face went from pale to a mottled, angry red. He took a step toward me, his chest puffed out, trying to use his height to intimidate me. "Darlene, I think you've had too much of that cheap wine you brought. Maybe you and Toby should leave." "We are leaving," I said, reaching down to take Toby's hand. He stood up beside me, his grip tight and warm. "But before we go, I think you should check your email, Richard. Or maybe call your commercial loan officer at Chase Bank, the one who is about to release the $3 million construction draw on the Dublin Heights project tomorrow morning." His eyes widened, the pupils shrinking to tiny black dots. "What did you do?" he hissed, his voice barely a whisper now, the bravado completely gone. I looked at my sister, whose hand was now shaking so hard she dropped her wine glass. It shattered on the expensive limestone, the red liquid spreading like a stain. "I did my job," I said quietly. The silence that settled over my sister's immaculate backyard was so heavy, you could hear the hum of the pool filter 50 feet away. Richard stood frozen, his mouth slightly open, the arrogance draining from his face in slow, visible waves. Annette was staring at the shattered glass at her feet, the dark red Cabernet soaking into the expensive limestone pavers like a bruise. I looked at them, but in my mind, I wasn't in their pristine suburban paradise anymore. I was back at my own kitchen table 3 weeks ago, sitting under the flickering fluorescent light of a fixture I'd been meaning to replace for 2 years. If you've ever sat alone at night, with nothing but the hum of an old refrigerator for company, and a stack of papers that could either save your family or tear it apart, you know the absolute stillness of those hours. You know how the air smells of cold tea and desperation? I had spent 25 years as an escrow officer, checking signatures, verifying chains of title, and making sure the small, hard-earned truths of ordinary people were locked safely in county deed books. I knew the power of a single sheet of paper, but I never expected that my own life's work would become the weapon I had to wield against my own sister's husband. It had started on a rainy Tuesday afternoon at Buckeye State Title. A commercial loan package had landed on my desk file, number 202248840. It was a routine title search for a $3 million construction loan that Dublin Heights LLC, Richard's development company, was securing from Chase Bank. The collateral for the loan was a prime 3-acre parcel on Sawmill Road, my father's land. My hand had trembled as I clicked on the digital scanned image of the quitclaim deed filed 6 months earlier. There it was, in black and white on my dual monitors. My father's signature, Arthur Vance, looked shaky, uneven, like a child trying to write on a moving train. My father had been a master carpenter. Even in his 70s, his hands were steady enough to drive a nail straight with a single blow. But 3 days before he died, he was heavily medicated, drifting in and out of consciousness. He couldn't have signed his name to a grocery receipt, let alone a deed transferring his most valuable asset to his son-in-law for $10. But it was the bottom of the page that made my heart stop. There, stamped in clear, dark ink, was my own notary seal. Asterisk Darlene Vance, Notary Public, State of Ohio. My commission expires June 14, 2026. Asterisk, and right next to it was a signature that looked remarkably like mine. A flowing cursive D with a sharp cross through the L. I remember sitting back in my worn office chair, the breath leaving my lungs in a sharp gasp. I felt cold from the inside out. I had never seen that document in my life. I had never notarized it. I closed my eyes, and the memory of my father's wake came rushing back. Richard had been so helpful that day. He had offered to go to my house to pick up extra folding chairs and a pot of coffee I'd left on the counter. He had been gone for nearly 2 hours. I had assumed he was just stuck in traffic or taking his time, but my home office was right off the kitchen. My notary stamp and my official journal were kept in the top drawer of my oak desk. He hadn't been helping me. He had been robbing me. He had stolen my stamp, used it to commit a felony, and then slipped it back into my drawer before I ever returned home. I knew I couldn't just scream or call the police right away. In the world of real estate and commercial lending, accusations without paper are just noise. If I made a scene without proof, Richard's expensive lawyers would paint me as a bitter, jealous sister-in-law looking for a handout. I had to be meticulous. I had to do what I had done every single day for a quarter of a century. I had to gather the paper. That night, I went home and pulled my official notary journal from my desk. In the state of Ohio, a notary is legally required to maintain a chronological log of every transaction they witness. I flipped to the pages for October. There was no entry for October 14th. The last entry was on October 12th. For a power of attorney I'd notarized for an elderly couple at my office. Next, I pulled my credit card statements from October. I found the transaction I was looking for. On October 14th at 2:15 p.m., the exact time listed on the forged deed was miles away. Buying liquid nutrition shakes and adult diapers for my father at a drugstore in Upper Arlington. I had the physical receipt in my tax folders. I had been miles away from my father's hospital bed at the moment Richard claimed I was standing there. Witnessing his signature, Darlene, a quiet voice had broken my concentration that night. I looked up. My Aunt Clara was standing in the doorway of my kitchen, holding a plate of leftover pot roast wrapped in tinfoil. She lived in the small duplex next to mine, and she had been my rock since my husband passed away 10 years ago. She saw the papers spread across the table, the highlighters, the printouts of the county auditor's records. She sat down opposite me, her arthritic fingers gently touching the edge of the forged deed. "Is it true?" she whispered, her eyes filling with tears. "Did Richard really do this to your father's memory? To Toby?" "He did, Aunt Clara," I said, my voice tight. "He used my name. He used my livelihood to steal the land Dad wanted Toby to have. If I don't prove this is a forgery, the bank will release the construction loan. Richard will break ground, and that land will be gone forever. Toby won't have his start." Clara reached across the table and squeezed my hand. Her grip was surprisingly strong for an 80-year-old woman. "Your father loved that boy, Darlene. He saw himself in him. Don't let Richard get away with this. You have the truth on your side. The truth needs to be formatted correctly, Clara," I told her, a small, weary smile breaking through my fear. "Otherwise, nobody listens." For the next 3 weeks, I worked in the shadows. I didn't say a word to Annette. I didn't confront Richard. Every time they invited me to dinner or sent a condescending text about Toby's graduation, I swallowed my pride and played the part of the quiet, struggling sister. I drafted a formal affidavit of forgery and notary fraud under Ohio Revised Code Section 147.141. I detailed every single discrepancy, the lack of an entry in my notary journal, my credit card receipt placing me miles away, and the medical records from the hospice care facility showing my father was nonverbal and lacked the cognitive capacity to execute legal documents on the date in question. I had a trusted colleague at a different title agency notarize my affidavit, a real, legal, binding signature. Then I went to the Ohio Secretary of State's Notary Commission and filed a formal complaint. Because my own commission was used in a fraud, I had to protect my license first. If I didn't report it immediately upon discovery, I could be held civilly and criminally liable for the fraud myself. But the final, most devastating piece of the puzzle was the timing. I knew that Richard's construction loan of $3 million was scheduled to close on the Monday after Toby's graduation. In the commercial lending world, title underwriters perform a gap search right before the funds are released to ensure no new liens, encumbrances, or disputes have been filed against the property. I didn't file my affidavit of forgery 3 weeks ago. If I had, Richard's lawyers would have had time to scramble, negotiate, or find another way to patch up the deal. Instead, I waited. I waited until the absolute last minute. I filed the formal affidavit with the Franklin County Recorder's Office at exactly 4:05 p.m. today, on the Friday before the Monday closing. Because of the digital filing system I used through my office, the document was recorded instantly. And because of the automatic alerts set up by Chase Bank's title insurance underwriter, an email was instantly triggered to the commercial loan officer, flagging the Sawmill Road property as having a clouded, disputed title. In the eyes of the bank, a dispute over the validity of the deed means the collateral is worthless. The loan is frozen. The project is dead in its tracks. And because Richard had already signed personal guarantees and paid non-refundable deposits to contractors based on the assumption that the money would flow on Monday, the freeze would trigger a financial domino effect that could ruin him. I looked back at Richard, who was now staring at his phone. He had finally opened his email. The color had completely drained from his face, leaving it a sickly, chalky white. His hands were shaking so badly he almost dropped his device into the grass. "This is a mistake," Richard stammered, his voice cracking, losing all of its booming authority. This is a technical error. Darlene, what did you file? What did you do to my file?" My sister Annette looked from her husband to me, her eyes wide with a mixture of terror and realization. She knew about the deed. I could see it in her eyes. She might not have planned the forgery, but she had certainly enjoyed the fruits of it. I took a deep breath, feeling the solid, honest weight of my father's memory standing right beside me. "I didn't do anything to your file, Richard," I said, my voice quiet, steady, and carrying to every corner of the silent yard. I just made sure the truth was finally written in ink. Richard's phone didn't just buzz. It seemed to vibrate with a frantic, heavy weight against his palm. The screen lit up with the name of his lead commercial loan officer at Chase Bank, a man named Henderson whom Richard had spent the last 3 months wining and dining at the Scioto Country Club. He didn't answer it. He couldn't. His thumb hovered over the green button, trembling so violently that the gold watch on his wrist clinked against his skin. The silence in the backyard was absolute now. The soft jazz music coming from the hidden outdoor speakers suddenly felt mocking, a cheerful soundtrack to a slow-motion car crash. "Darlene," Richard said, his voice dropping into a register I'd never heard from him before. It was low, raspy, and stripped of all its booming, chest-thumping authority. "What did you put in that filing? You can't just file things. There's a process. There are legal protocols." "I know the process, Richard," I said, my voice calm, level, and perfectly clear. "I've lived the process every single day for 25 years. While you were busy signing leases and taking credit for buildings other men built, I was the one verifying the paperwork that actually allowed those buildings to stand. I know exactly how the gears turn, and I know how to stop them. If you've ever had to sit across a dining room table from someone who has actively robbed you, who has looked you in the eye and asked you to pass the salt while they held the deed to your family's future in their pocket, you know the kind of discipline I'm talking about. For 3 weeks, I had to play the fool. I had to let Annette send me her condescending text messages about Toby's sweet little trade school. I had to sit through a family dinner 2 Sundays ago and watch Richard drink $40 bourbon while he lectured my son on the merits of hard work and knowing your place. I had smiled, I had nodded, I had even brought a plate of homemade potato salad, letting them think I was just the quiet, struggling, single mother sister who was grateful for a seat at their table. But every night, after Toby went to sleep, I sat at my own kitchen table with my reading glasses on, the light from my old desk lamp casting long shadows across the linoleum. I didn't just draft an affidavit, I built a fortress of paper. First, I had taken the forged deed to Sarah Jenkins, a certified forensic document examiner in Columbus. It cost me $1,200 money I had painstakingly saved over 2 years to buy Toby his first professional set of machinist tools. It was a terrifying sacrifice. That money was my safety net, the only padding I had between my family and the unexpected. But when Sarah looked at the signature under her microscope and compared it to my father's actual signature from his old union membership cards, she had looked up at me with a grim, knowing nod. "This isn't even a good forgery, Darlene," Sarah had told me, her voice gentle as she patted my hand. "The pen pressure is all wrong. Your father's hand had a distinct neuropathic tremor in his final months. This signature has the smooth, confident stroke of a younger, wealthy man trying to write slowly. And the notary stamp? It's a perfect match for your commission, but the ink formula doesn't match the standard pre-inked pad you use. I can write a report that will hold up in any court in the state." I had tucked that report into a worn leather folder, the same folder my father used to keep his carpentry blueprints in. Step by step, I executed the silent trap. I didn't file a lawsuit, not yet. A lawsuit would have tipped Richard off. His expensive corporate lawyers would have filed motions, delayed the proceedings, and dragged the case out until I was completely bankrupted by legal fees. Instead, I used my knowledge of title mechanics. In Ohio, when a commercial lender prepares to fund a multi-million-dollar loan, they require a title insurance policy. The underwriter must perform what we call a gap search in the county records right before the funds are wired. It's the final safety check to ensure no new liens judgments or title defects have appeared since the initial commitment was issued. By filing my affidavit of forgery and notary fraud at exactly 4:05 p.m. on Friday, I had placed a massive radioactive red flag directly on the title of the Sawmill Road property. The county recorder's digital system updates instantly. The moment the underwriter's automated system pulled the gap search for Monday's closing, the red flag went up. The title policy was instantly suspended. And without a clean title policy, Chase Bank's funding was legally frozen. "Darlene, sweetheart," a voice interrupted, slick and dripping with practice condescension. It was Victor Geller, Richard's attorney friend, who had been standing by the pool bar holding a half-empty glass of scotch. He stepped forward, smoothing the front of his tailored linen blazer. He had the tan of a man who spent his afternoons on a golf course, and the smile of a man who made his living finding loopholes in other people's lives. "Let's not do this here," Victor said, holding his hands up in a placating gesture, as if he were trying to calm down a hysterical child. "We're all family here. Well, almost all of us. You're obviously upset about Arthur's estate, and I get it. Grief does strange things to people. But you're interfering with a major commercial transaction. If you don't withdraw whatever garbage you just filed, Richard's company can sue you for tortious interference. We're talking treble damages, Darlene. You could lose your house. You could lose your job." I looked at Victor. I didn't flinch. I didn't let my eyes waver. "I know who you are, Victor," I said, my voice steady. "And I know you're the one who drafted that quitclaim deed for Richard. Did you also advise him to steal my notary stamp from my desk during my father's wake? Did you tell him that a single mother from the West Side wouldn't have the stomach to fight back?" Victor's slick smile faltered. His eyes darted to Richard, then back to me. "I have no idea what you're talking about. The deed was fully executed and notarized. I have the paperwork. You have a forgery, Victor. And as of 4:05 p.m., the Secretary of State's Notary Commission has a formal fraud complaint against my own commission number, accompanied by a forensic handwriting analysis and my credit card receipts showing. I was 3 miles away buying medical supplies when that deed was supposedly signed in my presence. If you want to talk about legal jeopardy, let's talk about your license to practice law in the state of Ohio, because facilitating a real estate transaction based on a known forged notary acknowledgement is a quick way to find yourself standing before the disciplinary board. The Scotch glass in Victor's hand gave a tiny, distinct rattle against his signet ring. He didn't say another word. He took a slow step backward, his eyes fixed on the limestone ground, completely withdrawing from the fight. He was a smart lawyer. He knew when a ship was sinking, and he had no intention of drowning with Richard. Annette let out a sharp, ragged sob. She stepped toward me, her manicured hands clutching her face, her designer sunglasses crooked on her nose. "Darlene, please, how can you do this to us? At Toby's graduation party, we did this for the family? Richard was going to build something beautiful. We were going to help you. We were going to give Toby a job at the development company once he finished his little school. Help us? I asked, looking at my sister, the sister I had shared a bedroom with when we were girls. Back when we had nothing but our father's love and a small house that always smelled of sawdust and fresh paint. You didn't want to help us, Annette. You wanted to own us. You wanted to feel big by making sure we stayed small. You let your husband steal the only thing Dad had left to give his grandson. And then you invited us here so you could throw a cheap pencil in my boy's face and laugh about it. Toby stood beside me, his tall frame quiet and solid. He didn't look angry. He looked at his aunt and uncle with a quiet, profound pity that cut deeper than any scream could have. I don't want a job from him, Aunt Annette, Toby said, his voice deep and calm, echoing my own strength. I want to build things that are real, not things built on lies. Richard's phone rang again. The sound was incredibly loud in the still afternoon air. He finally looked down at the screen. It wasn't the bank this time. It was his general contractor, a man who had 20 concrete trucks scheduled to pour foundations on the Sawmill Road site on Monday morning trucks that had been booked with a non-refundable $50,000 deposit. Richard looked up at me, his eyes wide and wild, like a cornered animal realizing the fence was too high to jump. The proud, untouchable developer was gone. In his place stood a man who had built his entire life on a foundation of sand, and the tide was coming in fast. Darlene, he whispered, his voice cracking. Please, let's talk about this. We can work something out. I'll buy the land from Toby. I'll pay him market value. Just call the bank. Tell them it was a mistake. I looked at the yellow pencil resting in the mustard on Toby's plate. Its cracked pink eraser, a symbol of the cheap, dirty mistakes Richard thought he could just rub out. The bank doesn't take phone calls from me, Richard, I said, picking up my purse and sliding my arm through Toby's. They only read the public record. The second phone call didn't just ring. It boomed. Because Richard had his phone synced to the backyard's high-end Bluetooth rock speakers to play his soft jazz playlist, the incoming call cut the music off instantly. The default marimba ringtone blasted through the manicured hedges, echoing off the limestone pool deck like a siren. In his panic, Richard's thumb swiped the screen. He didn't realize he had answered it, let alone that the audio was still routing through the entire outdoor speaker system. Richard? Richard, are you there? The voice belonged to Henderson, the senior commercial loan officer at Chase Bank. It was a voice that usually sounded like warm honey and expensive golf club memberships. Right now, it sounded like a dry branch snapping in the winter cold. I'm here, Henderson, Richard stammered, his hand flying to his ear, not realizing his mistake. I'm at a family event. Can I call you back on Monday? There isn't going to be a Monday, Richard. Henderson's voice echoed from the hidden speakers in the shrubbery, clear as a bell. The country club guests stood frozen, their eyes darting from the bushes to Richard's sweating face. Our title underwriter just pulled the pre-funding gap search. A formal affidavit of forgery and notary fraud was recorded with the Franklin County Recorder's Office at 4:05 p.m. It's got a forensic document examiner's report attached, medical records, and a sworn statement from the notary of record who happens to be your sister-in-law, Darlene Vance. A collective, sharp intake of breath rippled through the crowd. Annette looked like she had been struck by lightning. Her designer sunglasses slipped down the bridge of her nose, revealing eyes wide with absolute, unadulterated terror. Henderson, listen to me, Richard hissed, spinning around, trying to find where the sound was coming from, his face turning a dark, dangerous shade of purple. It's a family dispute. A bitter relative trying to shake us down for money. My lawyers are on it. We can clear this up by Tuesday morning. Are you deaf, Richard? Henderson's voice boomed back, cold and clinical. This isn't a civil dispute. This is a third-degree felony filing. The underwriter has officially withdrawn the title insurance policy commitment. Without title insurance, the bank is legally prohibited from funding the $3 million draw. The wire is canceled. Furthermore, under Section 4.2 of our loan agreement, a filing of this nature constitutes an immediate administrative default. We are freezing your operating accounts associated with Dublin Heights Well LC. Do not call my cell phone again. All future communication will go through our legal department." The line went dead. The silence that followed was so thick you could hear the water splashing gently against the skimmer of the saltwater pool. If you've ever watched a bully realize the kid he's been picking on is the one holding the keys to his locker, you know the exact expression that was on Richard's face. The chest puffing, the booming voice, the pastel polo arrogance, it all dissolved, leaving behind a desperate, middle-aged man whose entire life was built on a mountain of high-interest debt and stolen dreams. I know some of you sitting at your kitchen tables right now might think I was being cruel. You might think, asterisk Darlene, he's family. Why didn't you just pull him aside and talk to him, asterisk? But let me ask you this. Did Richard think about family when he went into my home, opened my private desk, and stole my professional notary stamp? Did he think about family when he forged my father's shaking hand on that deed, knowing that if the fraud was ever discovered, the state of Ohio would strip me of my license, my livelihood, and my ability to feed my son? Did he think about family when he threw a cheap, dirty pencil onto my boy's plate and mocked his future in front of 20 people? No, he didn't. He thought I was weak because I was quiet. He thought because I wore $20 dresses and drove a 10-year-old sedan, I didn't have the teeth to bite back. He forgot that the quietest people are the ones who spend their lives studying the rules while the loud ones are busy breaking them. "Victor," Richard choked out, turning his wild eyes toward his attorney friend, who was still standing by the pool bar. "Victor, do something. You drafted the deed. Tell them it's legal. Tell them we can file an emergency injunction." Victor Geller didn't look at Richard. He slowly placed his scotch glass down on the bar tile. He didn't use his slick, smooth lawyer voice anymore. He looked at me, his eyes taking in my calm posture, the worn leather folder tucked under my arm, and the absolute certainty in my eyes. He knew exactly what a forensic report meant. He knew what a Secretary of State fraud complaint did to a notary commission. And most importantly, he knew what it would do to his own law license if he tried to defend a documented forgery. "I'm leaving, Richard," Victor said quietly, reaching into his pocket for his car keys. "What?" Richard yelled, taking a step toward him. "You're my counsel. You're on the LLC operating agreement." "Not anymore," Victor said, his voice dropping to a muttered undertone as he began walking toward the side gate. "I'm withdrawing as your representative, effective immediately. I suggest you hire a criminal defense attorney, Richard. Because when the bank's fraud unit gets a hold of that forensic report, they aren't going to just cancel the loan. They're going to call the county prosecutor." The gate clicked shut behind Victor. The sound was like a gavel striking a block. One by one, the country club friends began to move. It was like watching rats realize the yacht had hit an iceberg. No one said goodbye. No one stopped to finish their craft beers or their smoked salmon crostini. They just quietly slipped their designer sunglasses back on, murmured excuses about prior engagements, and walked briskly toward the driveway. Within 3 minutes, the grand backyard was empty, save for the caterers who were frantically packing up their silver trays, eager to get paid before the credit cards on file declined. My sister Annette stood in the center of her perfect lawn, her hands pressed against her mouth. The red wine stain on her white linen pants had dried into a dark, ugly brown smear. "Darlene," she whispered, her voice cracking with a desperate, childish whine. "How could you? We're sisters. We're blood. Dad wouldn't have wanted this. He wouldn't have wanted you to ruin us." I looked at my sister, the girl I had shared a bedroom with, the sister who had watched our father work 60 hours a week in his drafty workshop, his fingers permanently stained with walnut stain and wood glue, just to make sure we had shoes without holes in them. "Dad wanted Toby to have that land, Annette," I said, my voice steady and quiet, but carrying the weight of 20 years of silent sacrifice. "He told me that in his final days, he wanted Toby to have a foundation so he wouldn't have to struggle the way we did. And you sat by and let your husband forge his name. You let him steal from your own nephew so you could buy a bigger house and put limestone pavers in your backyard. We were going to pay Toby back. Annette sobbed, the tears streaming down her face, ruining her expensive makeup. Richard was going to give him a piece of the development. A percentage. A percentage of a lie is still a lie, Annette, I said. Toby walked over to the table where his graduation plate still sat. The yellow Dixon Ticonderoga pencil was still resting in the dried mustard, looking incredibly small and foolish against the fine porcelain. With a slow, deliberate movement, my 18-year-old son picked up the pencil. He didn't look angry. He looked older, taller, his shoulders square under his graduation gown. He wiped the mustard off the yellow paint with a linen napkin, then tucked the pencil carefully into the front pocket of his gown, right over his heart. He looked directly at Richard, who was now sitting heavily on one of the limestone steps, his head in his hands, his breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps. "Thanks for the pencil, Uncle Richard," Toby said, his voice deep, calm, and carrying his grandfather's quiet, working-class dignity. "I'm going to use it to draft the blueprints for the machine shop I'm going to build on grandfather's land. I'll make sure to measure twice, so I don't make any mistakes." Richard didn't look up. He couldn't. My Aunt Clara stepped up beside me, her old arthritic hand sliding into mine. Her fingers were warm, dry, and steady. She looked at Annette, then at Richard, and shook her head with a quiet, sorrowful pity. "You forgot who we are, Annette," Clara said softly. "You forgot where you came from. We don't steal from our own. And we don't let anyone make our children feel small." I took Toby's hand on my right and Claire's on my left. We walked across the limestone patio, past the sparkling pool that Toby had never been allowed to swim in, and down the side path toward the driveway. Behind us, the sound of Richard's phone ringing started up again, blasting through the Bluetooth speakers, a loud, demanding alarm that he would have to answer for the rest of his life. We didn't talk on the drive home, not at first. The hum of my 10-year-old sedan was a comforting, steady vibration beneath my hands as I gripped the steering wheel, my knuckles slowly losing their tension. In the back seat, Aunt Clara was quiet, her eyes closed as she rested her head against the window, her breathing slow and even. Next to me, Toby sat with his hands folded in his lap. Between his thick, calloused fingers, he still held that cheap yellow pencil. He wasn't playing with it. He was just holding it, his thumb resting gently against the cracked pink eraser, as if it were a surveyor's tool he was using to measure the distance between the life we had yesterday and the life we were going to build tomorrow. I know some of you might be waiting for the part where I tell you we went home and popped open a bottle of expensive champagne, or laughed about how we'd finally put Richard in his place. But if you've ever had to hold the line against your own blood, you know that victory doesn't taste like sweet wine. It tastes like cold water after a long run. It's a relief, yes, but your chest still burns and your legs still shake from the effort. When we got back to our small duplex on the west side, the sun was beginning to dip below the tree line, casting long orange shadows across our small gravel driveway. I walked into my kitchen, the familiar smell of old wood and lemon cleaner wrapping around me like a worn-out cardigan. I filled the kettle with tap water and set it on the stove. As the blue flame licked the bottom of the kettle, I sat down at my worn laminate kitchen table, the very table where I had spent 25 years checking title commitments, calculating interest rates, and making sure my boy had lunch money for the next day. "Mom," Toby said, standing in the doorway of the kitchen. He had taken off his navy blue graduation gown, revealing his plain gray t-shirt and jeans. "Is Uncle Richard going to jail?" I looked at my son, seeing the quiet, honest soul my father had loved so much. "I don't know, Toby," I said softly, gesturing for him to sit across from me. "The bank's fraud unit has the forensic report now. In Ohio, forging a notary acknowledgement on a deed is a third-degree felony. It's up to the county prosecutor to decide what charges to bring, but his development company is done. Without that $3 million loan, his creditors are going to descend on him like locusts. He nodded slowly, looking down at the table. I don't want him to go to jail. I just wanted grandfather's land to stay grandfather's land. It is your land, Toby, I said, reaching across the table to cover his hand with mine. The moment that affidavit of forgery was recorded, the forged deed became legally void *ab initio *, which means it's as if it never existed in the eyes of the law. The title reverts back to your grandfather's estate, and under his actual will, it goes directly into your custodial trust. It's yours. To build on, to keep, or to sell, you have your foundation. The kettle began to whistle, a sharp, rising tone that cut through the quiet house. I stood up to turn off the burner, pouring the hot water over 2 tea bags in chipped ceramic mugs. The months that followed were a slow, grinding machinery of legal filings and public reckonings. I didn't have to hire expensive lawyers. The state did the heavy lifting for me. Once the Franklin County Prosecutor's Office saw the forensic report, the credit card receipts, and the lack of an entry in my notary journal, they presented the case to a grand jury. Richard was indicted on counts of forgery, identity theft, and notary fraud. To save himself from a lengthy prison sentence, Richard did what bullies always do when the lights are turned on. He cut a deal. He pled guilty to a lesser felony charge, received 5 years of intense supervised probation. It was ordered to pay massive restitution to the contractors he had defaulted on. His development company, Dublin Heights LLC, filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy before the autumn leaves had even finished falling. The silver Mercedes disappeared from their driveway, replaced by a sensible, used sedan. The luxury home with the limestone pavers and the saltwater pool was put on the market, sold at a loss to satisfy the bank's liens. Annette and Richard moved into a rented townhouse on the outer belt, far away from the country club friends who had so quickly vanished into the suburban afternoon. I watched it all happen from my desk at Buckeye State Title. I didn't gloat. I didn't call the local papers. I just did my job, verifying signatures, reading the fine print, and keeping my head down. Then, on a cold Tuesday evening in November, my doorbell rang. It was snowing, the first light dusting of the season, the white flakes melting as soon as they touched the warm porch light. I opened the door to find my sister Annette standing there. She wasn't wearing her designer sunglasses. She wasn't wearing her fine linen pants. She wore a heavy, generic winter coat, her hair slightly damp from the snow, her face pale and lined with a weariness that made her look 10 years older than me. She looked at me, her lips trembling, her hands shoved deep into her pockets. "Darlene," she said, her voice small and cracked. "Can I come in?" I stood there for a long moment, the cold wind blowing past her into my warm hallway. I thought about the 3 dozen lemon squares that went untouched. I thought about the cheap pencil thrown into the mustard on my son's plate. I thought about my father's shaking hand and how she had stood by and let her husband steal his legacy. But then I looked at her eyes. Beneath the anger and the pride that had built up over decades of trying to prove she was better than us, I saw the little girl I used to share a room with. The girl who used to cry when the thunderstorms rolled over the Ohio plains, reaching out for my hand in the dark. "Come in, Annette," I said quietly, stepping aside. She walked into my kitchen, her eyes tracking the worn linoleum, the outdated cabinets, and the cooling tea kettle on the stove. She sat down at my laminate table, her shoulders slumping. I didn't offer her wine. I made her a cup of black tea, placing the chipped mug in front of her. "We had to sell the house," she whispered, her fingers tracing the rim of the mug. "We have to move into a 3-bedroom apartment near Hilliard, Richard. Richard is working as an assistant manager at a hardware store. He's not allowed to hold a real estate license anymore. His name is ruined." "I know," I said, sitting opposite her. "I hated you, Darlene," she said, looking up, her eyes shining with tears. "When you did that at the party, in front of everyone. I wanted to see you fail. I wanted to see you lose everything. But then, when the lawyers started showing me the documents, when I saw the forgery report, I realized Richard had lied to me too. He told me Dad signed it. He told me it was all legal. He told me you were just being difficult. She paused, a single tear running down her cheek, leaving a clean trail through her makeup. But he used your stamp. He could have ruined your life, Darlene. And I didn't ask questions because I wanted the house and the pool and the country club. I was greedy, and I let him treat Toby like dirt. She reached into her purse and pulled out a small velvet box. She opened it and set it on the table. Inside was our mother's gold locket, the one with the tiny hand-painted porcelain rose on the front. Our father had given it to Annette when Mother passed, and she had kept it locked away, too precious to wear. "I want Toby to have this," Annette said, her voice barely a whisper. "Ah, or you. I don't deserve to keep it. I forgot who our father was, Darlene. I forgot how hard he worked to make sure we had a name we could be proud of." I looked at the locket, then at my sister. The anger I had carried for 6 months, the heavy, hot stone in my chest, suddenly felt incredibly light. It didn't disappear, you don't just forget a betrayal like that, but it softened. It turned into something manageable, like a scar that only twinges when the weather changes. "Keep the locket, Annette," I said gently, pushing the velvet box back toward her. "Give it to your daughter when she's older. But if you want to make things right, call Toby on his birthday. Ask him how his classes are going. Treat him like your nephew, not a charity case." She looked at me, her eyes wide with a quiet, surprised gratitude. She nodded, her throat too tight to speak. She stayed for another hour, drinking her tea in quiet, measured sips. We didn't talk about Richard, and we didn't talk about the lawsuit. We talked about the winter weather, the price of groceries, and a memory from when we were kids, back when Dad would bring home scrap wood from the shop and build us birdhouses in the backyard. When she left, the door closed with a soft, quiet click. It wasn't a grand reconciliation. We weren't going to be best friends, and the trust that had been shattered would take years to even begin to rebuild. But the door wasn't locked anymore. It was just slightly ajar, letting in a little bit of humanity, a little bit of grace. The next spring, the ground on Sawmill Road thawed. Toby graduated from his precision machining program at the top of his class. He didn't have a single dollar of student debt. On a bright Saturday morning in May, we drove out to the 3-acre parcel. The grass was green and wild, growing tall around the edges of the old timber line. Toby walked to the center of the clearing, his boots sinking slightly into the soft, rich Ohio soil. He had a blueprint in his hand, a neat, precise drawing of a modest 3-bay machine shop. He had drafted it himself, using a KD program at school. But he had transferred the initial sketches onto graph paper by hand. I watched him reach into his pocket and pull out a short, yellow pencil. The pink eraser was still cracked and the paint was slightly chipped, but the lead was sharpened to a perfect, fine point. He bent down, drove a wooden stake into the ground to mark the northeast corner of the foundation, and used the pencil to write the date on the pine wood, May 14th, 2025. Aunt Clara stood beside me, leaning heavily on her cane, her face lit by the warm spring sun. "He's got his grandfather's hands, Darlene," she murmured, a proud, peaceful smile on her wrinkled face. "And he's got his mother's heart." I took a deep breath, the sweet smell of damp earth and blooming clover filling my lungs. I looked at my son, his tall frame silhouetted against the bright blue sky, building his future on the very ground his grandfather had saved for him. If you're sitting at your kitchen table tonight, looking at a stack of bills, or feeling the sting of someone trying to make you feel small, I want you to remember something. The people who try to write you out of your own story are usually the ones who don't know how to write anything and value themselves. They use loud voices and cheap tricks because they don't have the patience to build something that lasts. But you do. Keep your head down. Gather your paper. Trust the truth. Because at the end of the day, love is a gift, not a line item in a budget, and the quietest hand is always the one that holds the pen.